The developing world would contribute to additional conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union as they saw both an opportunity for new alliances and regional security and, of course, resources. And the conflict, of course, would evolve out of who was going to get to it first. The balance of power at stake would result in crisis in a lot of the world, and you can take a look at this map and see a lot of the places that we have studied or will study throughout this course. We're not going to get to them all, but it highlights some of the key ones that we've reviewed. Of course, the CIA really developed out of the end of the World War II, but it really wouldn't become the operation that it did until Eisenhower took over the presidency in 1953. And the CIA would be used as a covert op and really a Cold War tool. Why? Because it was cheap and easy, right? It was outcome oriented. They were going to get results, and we're going to look at a couple examples today. And the United States had plausible deniability. If they had a front man in another country, even though they were supported by the United States and specifically the CIA, we could claim that we didn't have any responsibility. In the end, the CIA becomes used as an instrument of containment to assist friendly governments and to prevent communist expansion. A few of the hotspots that we're going to look at, some in more detail than others, include Iran in 1953, immediately followed by Guatemala. We're going to touch on what's going on or what happened in Indonesia in 1958, the Congo in 1960, and we'll spend quite a bit more time on Cuba in another unit in 1960, and of course Vietnam as well in more detail. So what kind of methods were used by the CIA to basically ensure U.S.-friendly governments around the world? Well, we would overthrow governments. We would assassinate people, or at least attempt to, use mail, phone surveillance, infiltrate different organizations such as student organizations, journalistic organizations. You'll see infiltration of even the church in Guatemala, and provide money to different groups of people, paying thugs and gangs on the street. Eisenhower said, "I have come to the conclusion that some of our traditional ideas of international sportsmanship are scarcely applicable in the morass in which the world now flounders. We must not confuse these values with mere procedures," he says, just a couple years after coming to power. So basically, we live by these ideals of liberty and freedom, but that doesn't mean we're going to act that way. And our actions, he said, are justified so that we can live with the freedom that we want. So the first example is the Iranian coup, 1953, and it's a rather important one, so we're going to talk a little bit about what happened here. Iran had always had strategic value in the world, or at least as the world started discovering the value of oil. This map shows Russia and England sort of vying for control of resources and influence over Iran back in the late 1800s, the 19th century. The statesman George Lord Curzon, famous for the Curzon Line in Poland, in 1892 says, "To me, I confess they are but pieces on a chessboard upon which is being played out a game for the domination of the world." That was true in 1892, and it's going to be true in the 1940s and 1950s and beyond, right? So what really happened was, as World War II, World War II, and some other events would happen, the British were able to consolidate their control. They were able to take control of any political dissent, the weaknesses in the government, to try and consolidate their power over the economy first, because that was their goal, and then, of course, as a byproduct of the political system going on there. But of course, Iran, their Shah, who was in power in the 1940s, would remain neutral during World War II, which allowed the it would allow the Nazis the opportunity to try and get in there and take over some of those badly needed oil reserves. So the Soviet Union, you may remember, and the British invade to protect the oil. They oust the Shah, who decided to remain neutral, because that guy clearly wasn't on their side. And the big issue was that the Soviet Union doesn't actually withdraw when they're supposed to at the end, which would lead to this Anglo-Soviet conflict that would erupt the first year following World War II ending. It's going to show the foreshadows, sort of the conflict of the Cold War. It's going to foreshadow some of the issues that oil is going to present and the geopolitical importance of Iran in this evolving East versus West conflict. Of course, the British will eventually ensure that the Soviet Union is out and they will regain control not only of their oil and the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company, but also in the political situation through the installation of the previous Shah's son. This Mohammad Reza Shah will be, in fact, to date, the last Shah of Iran. He's always going to be seen as foreign imposed by the British and then sustained later by the United States, which we'll talk about. The thing is he's really just a constitutional monarch, and that's really important because the people start to develop this sense of nationalism, this sense of wanting more for Iran, to not just be a colony, to be controlled by a foreign government who is essentially extracting resources. So the prime minister that they end up electing in 1951 is Mohammad Mossadegh, and his goals are really about nationalization, and he sees that that could potentially create some conflict, but he proposes a better division of resources. The Anglo-Iranian oil company is going to keep all of this money that they're extracting from Iran, and Iran says, I don't think so. We propose a deal where we get some of the money. Now, not all of the money, and they're not nationalizing the oil. They just want a better distribution. But of course, the British, who have only everything to win here, they're winning everything. They reject this outright and reject every further agreement and concession. So the United States, a little bit concerned about the loss of oil, because as Eisenhower says here, Lord knows what we do without the oil, starts to conspire with newly re-elected Prime Minister Churchill. You remember that he was out of office for a bit at Potsdam and beyond, and now is back in power. Eisenhower and Churchill will basically hatch a scheme to try and make things right in their eyes. Now, Churchill and the British government will enact an economic embargo, which will have very stressful impact on the economy and the lives of the people. It will end up eroding the popularity of Mossadegh. He ends up cracking down a little bit more because he is struggling with popularity and trying to maintain the economy as a result of this British pressure, but they are still unwilling to concede to the British demands. Mossadegh, of course, I should have mentioned, had nationalized the oil, and the British were responding to this nationalization of oil. Mossadegh said, if you're not going to share it, I'm just going to take it because, of course, it belongs to us. And then the economic embargo resulted. The Americans, for their part, had a whole nother plan in place that really couples the economic embargo. They're going to bribe Iranian politicians. They're going to basically hire street thugs to protest. They start the pioneering the fake news campaign. The CIA creates all this anti-Mossadegh propaganda saying that he's basically a dictator, that Iran needs to save themselves from this tyrant. And of course, this guy was trying to promote democracy, trying to reserve resources for himself. So U.S. paid thugs, people posing as communists hired by the United States would create disruption in the street, all of this to create the sense among the population of instability that Mossadegh is failing. And so the Shah will have him removed from power and install a new military leader in place. The removal of Mossadegh will basically be a success for the United States, or at least they will see it that way in the short term. This is the first time the United States uses the CIA to successfully remove an elected leader from power. So what does this suggest about the U.S. and its shifting Cold War strategies? How are we going to start addressing our concerns? What does this suggest about the CIA and the role that they're going to play in all of this? Of course, Mossadegh, for his part, is mad about the United States, calls them a cruel and imperialistic country, stealing from a needy and naked people. And really the brains behind all of this, not really Eisenhower so much, but the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, the CIA director, and John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, would really have hatched this plan, and this is going to become a blueprint for future takeovers in other countries, as we'll see. Historian Stephen Kinzer says that overnight, with this one event, overnight the CIA became a central part of American foreign policy apparatus, and covert action came to be regarded as a cheap and effective way to shape the course of world events. These two guys looking proud of themselves, seeing it as a victory, but unaware of the growing underlying anti-American, but Anglo-American really sentiment that will develop and fester over the years. Of course, the Shah is really our guy. The Shah, even though he was installed by the British, and we get involved in this Iranian coup in part because the British had helped us in Korea. They reminded us of that, and felt like we owed them. But also because we did fear the socialization or the socialism feel of this nationalism of oil. The Shah is in awe of our power. He just cuddles up to any president that he can, and he will, in fact, remain close to every single president until he is removed from power. He says, I owe my throne to God, my people, and my army to you, the United States. And the United States did, in fact, funnel millions of dollars to this guy over the decades that he remained in power. But what was the impact? Well, it would set a precedent for covert U.S. intervention. It was a success, as we saw in the short term. It ends Iranian democracy because the Shah became increasingly autocratic. He would end any sort of political opposition. He outlawed unions, outlawed other political parties, and really just becomes another strongman. And he was the United States' installed strongman, so that's going to become a little bit problematic. The other thing is the economy immediately improves, but that's only because the British lifted the embargo. So he looks like a little bit of a hero at first, but his mismanagement and the corruption that would overtake him, his false sense of security because the United States had his back, and his ability to basically act without impunity would lead to increasing opposition to this guy who was seen more and more like a foreign puppet. In fact, the economy would become weaker, the wealth gap would increase, inflation would develop, and the energy crisis in the 1970s really kind of tipped things against him. He would eventually, of course, be overthrown. Origins of Iranian anti-American sentiment are here with our control over their government, which is dependent on oil, and of course in 1979, the Iranian Revolution, which would lead to the Iranian hostage crisis, which you may have heard about before. So is any of this good? Probably not in the long term. So why did we do it? Is it about the oil? Dean Acheson says, you know what, this whole idea that we were going in there to save ourselves from another communist country is really a false narrative, and that it was really about American and Anglo-American imperialist ambitions clashing up against rising nationalism. Of course, the other view from another historian says that don't discount the fact that we're actually fearful of Soviet expansionism. Like, clearly the Soviet Union had been trying to make inroads into Iran. It looked a little suspect that Mossadegh was trying to nationalize the oil. He wasn't really a communist, but there was a communist party active there, and they did support him. So Eisenhower had run in the 1952 elections accusing the Democrats of being soft on communism, saying that we lost China, that Roosevelt had given away the East, that Truman was no better. And so he really needed to put his actions where his words were and try to, in fact, end any expansion of Soviet communism in the region. How does history support this? Well, of course, clearly the oil played a critical role in World War II, and it would continue to play a critical role in the world. The United States would go into other countries protecting resources such as Guatemala, Congo, Cuba, we'll talk about. And of course, back to Dean Acheson again, who believed that our domestic prosperity, our ability to produce money, to be a wealthy country, was inextricably linked to our national security. On the other side, you've got the Iranian crisis in 1946, the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, the fall of China, Korean War, the Red Scare, all of those things that sort of suggest maybe it was actually just the perfect combination. Central America will be no different, of course. The United States have a long and complicated history. In Central America, this is one map that shows some of our ambitions throughout the Cold War. Of course, this other map predates the Cold War, showing some of our interventions in the region starting at the turn of the century, once the Roosevelt Corollary was in place, and just a little bit before that. The United States, of course, had intervened more than 40 times in Latin America between 1900 and 1933, usually to protect our business interests. Remember dollar diplomacy? This is alive and well, and this is going to impact our decisions to go into Guatemala. 2% of the people owned 72% of the land in Guatemala. This wealth disparity was only going to be made worse by the United Fruit Company, UFC here, United Fruit Company, which would come to control 80 to 90% of the banana business. They also were the largest landowner in Guatemala and controlled 3.5 million acres of land in Central America and the Caribbean. So the United Fruit Company clearly had deep pockets. They were exploiting the people of these countries who remained impoverished and growing sentiments of nationalism and outrage. You would actually see a few reforms start in 1944. You would see minimum wages implemented by a couple of these reformers. You would see the attempt to create near universal suffrage. And Arbenz is going to be our focus. He is the reformer who actually finally comes in and says, how about some land reform? Let's take some of this land from these big, gigantic American corporations and give it back to the peasants and the farmers. Well, the United Fruit Company had a lot of money to lose in this, and they weren't going to let that go easy. Of course, they also had just the right connections. Their profits were twice as much as the entire country of Guatemala. I mean, they were that rich and, of course, that powerful. They were also carrying Uncle Sam a little bit with the wealth. So they would start this big lobbying campaign after Arbenz was elected in 1951, coincidentally the same year as Mohamed Mossadegh. And they would lobby their old friends, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, who, of course, we know were cabinet officials. And they had done some legal work for the United Fruit Company and had sat on their board of trustees and, more importantly, had a big, clear, close connection to Eisenhower. So what methodology are we going to put in place? They're going to have protesters come out, these right-wing Guatemalan protesters, all paid for by the CIA, to show their discontent with these nationalistic land reform ideas. They're also going to launch a propaganda campaign, some of it via the radio where they're accessing people more readily, but also they're going to use the church to write letters to promote this idea that we reject communism and that God wants them to reject communism. Of course, the letters were written by the CIA, although the church supported it enough. We're going to have a bombing campaign. They're going to basically blanket certain areas. These planes are flown by CIA pilots, and it creates an entire feeling of disruption and instability. It makes Arbenz appear weaker than he really is, as the United States is trying to subvert his mission. The coup will be launched in 1954 with a $2.7 million budget. They would basically leave death notes on political leaders' doors, like create this feeling of fear and terror, create protests and riots in the streets. They would put together an army of people, and eventually Arbenz would be forced out of power, and Carlos Castillo Armas comes into power in his place. When he comes into power, you'll see that he also will crack down on dissent. He will eliminate any political parties that are not his political party. I mean, it sounds like Stalin. Oh, and Mao also, right? He eliminates labor unions. He eliminates peasant organizations. He creates camps to house dissidents. He dismisses the Constitution and basically takes complete power. And they're going to struggle. They're having some economic difficulties. He inherits economic difficulties, and the United States will basically give him tens of millions of dollars to help prop up their regime. All of this is happening and creating dissent. The Arbenz wasn't a communist. He was really much more of a moderate. And the Communist Party didn't really have solid roots until Armas comes in and the people start to reject him and his installation by the United States. People saw through the transparency that this was really a U.S. imperialistic attempt to control the Guatemalan economy for the benefit of the United Fruit Company and the United States. So you will see leftist organizations like the Communist Party actually start to really establish themselves in the wake of the overthrow. Armas himself gets assassinated just a few years later in 1957 by a leftist radical, and a civil war will ensue from 1960 to 1996, 36 years of civil war, mostly targeting the Mayans. It becomes known in some ways as a Mayan genocide or the silent Holocaust because of the class conflict that will ensue. Of course, the Mayans and the peasants having the most to gain from land redistribution. So 200,000 women, men, children killed, 600 villages were destroyed. And this was all because we were concerned about communism. And this was Democratic and Republican presidents alike who would funnel everything that they could. More leftist organizations would form and become more ardent in their belief that they wanted to end U.S. imperialism. And the rightist groups that the United States supported would become more repressive than ever. The message was not lost on the rest of Latin America. Diego Rivera, the famous painter, would make this mural, Glorious Victory, in the year following the coup. He shows John Foster Dulles and his brother, of course, Alan Dulles, right here with bags full of money that they're passing out to all of their right-wing military supporters. And of course, Carlos Castillo Armas here with a pocket full of money, and dead Mayan children in the background with the church's blessing, who has basically endorsed this. You see people working for the United Fruit Company, and then Eisenhower himself in the front of this painting. And I highlight this painting because the rest of Latin America in particular, there are lots of countries, but Latin America in particular were alarmed by the means that the United States had taken to ensure their profit over democracy and over the lives of the individual people living there. Another famous person who was here during the coup was Che Guevara. Che Guevara actually was living in Guatemala at the time of the coup, would become even more solid in his anti-U.S. and anti-imperialistic views, and would seek safe passage to Mexico after the coup had ended, where he would end up meeting Fidel Castro, changing history, of course. So did the United States win? Well, they secured their banana republic, at least for a while. But what was the impact? Well, it was an end to democracy in Guatemala. It led to anti-American settlement in Guatemala and the rest of the region, of course. It was a major cause of 30 years of civil war in Guatemala.
Guatemala and Iran were no exception, of course. Indonesia saw a very similar fate, starting upon declaration of independence in 1945 after World War II. Like others, they had had a long history of colonization. They're an archipelago in the Pacific Ocean that had been resource rich. They had been controlled by the Dutch until after 1945. After World War II. The Dutch East Indies, of course, had been invaded by Japan, sought after for their resources, which would help them some, but clearly not enough. And in August of 1945, after the Japanese defeat, Indonesia would declare independence. The United States, of course, was happy to see this independence because they were looking to foster an ally, and would even send out organizations around the region to help secure democracy in Japan. But many of these organizations were spying on nations such as Indonesia because the United States was extra paranoid about the Asian domino theory, especially after the fall of China to communism in 1949. They worried that if Indonesia, with all the resources that it had to offer, could go next, what would that mean for Japan? When would Japan fall? And the United States had to protect their allies and assets in the region. Of course, it helped that there was a lot of oil in Indonesia that wanted to be exploited by the United States. It made them a more valuable ally. And of course, Texaco and Chevron would get into that game quickly. And you could have seen in the last slide some of that oil production that would increase from the 1960s throughout the duration into the modern day. So the economic agenda of the United States and the political agenda with the Cold War were really aligned when it came to Indonesia. And Sukarno, who was the leader who had declared independence in 1945, was quickly befriended by presidents such as Eisenhower and Kennedy in the United States. But he was also courting others, such as Castro and Che Guevara. You may remember Ho Chi Minh from the Vietnam Civil War, Mao Zedong. And so the United States started to become a little bit nervous about his chummy relationship with some of these people. Moreover, the nationalization of mines and plantations that were taken by Sukarno made him seem a little bit more leftist than the United States was comfortable with. And in 1958, the United States would deem him enough of a danger, despite their minimal trade with the Soviet Union, that they would help orchestrate an attempt. They would deliver weapons, they would set up regional bases, they launched a psychological warfare against Sukarno in radio broadcasts. Of course, the attempt fails horribly when the United States bombs, without Eisenhower's approval, I'll say. John Foster Dulles authorized the bombing of civilian islands. A pilot was shot down. It was a total disaster. But the results are that people became more anti-United States. communist popularity in the Indonesian Communist Party, of course, increased. Sukarno, who already had an anti-imperialist, um, you know, kind of thread within him, became even more so, delivering speeches to the United Nations, and by 1965 was solidly leaning communist. Here he is, buddying up to Khrushchev. Well, the United States definitely isn't going to stand for this, and they find their own buddy in General Suharto, who is a solidly anti-communist. And though Suharto would sort of start making allies with the United States under the Johnson administration, you see him here with Nixon. In 1965, there was a communist coup to really flip Indonesia to be solidly communist. The United States helped General Suharto put down this coup, and of course, he is very quickly, within that year, named, not elected president, forms a dictatorship, purges up to 1 million communists who are massacred. The United States is fully knowledgeable about it and would rule through corruption and brutality for 31 years as a close ally, of course, of the United States. Here you see him with various presidents up through Bill Clinton in the 90s before Suharto would step down from power. The Congo is another perfect example of a country that had been taken over by the Belgian King Leopold II, exploited it for their resources before 1960 Declaration of Independence that elected Lumumba president, but almost immediately there was a separatist movement that broke out. Remember, the Dutch in Europe had colonized this place for nearly a century, so there were plenty of wealthy white people who had colonized the most resource-rich area, which was called Katanga, and now that they are independent, Katanga wants to be its own state as well. So the United States refuses to help Lumumba, who is seeking their support. They say no to arms, they say no to money, and the Soviet Union quickly steps up to help Lumumba. This really creates division. It creates problems for the United States, but it creates division within the Congo. So now you see these factions that are pro-U.S., pro-USSR. They are anti-communist, pro-capitalist. They are this Katanga region versus people who are supporting Lumumba. Of course, the United States would find an ally in General Mobutu, who just was anti-communist, which was enough. They would help him overthrow Lumumba, deem Lumumba a communist, have him arrested, and on January 1961, less than 6 months or so after he was elected, he would be assassinated. What's the impact? There were still factions. You see civil unrest, military rule, and Mobutu would become the dictator and a close friend of the United States. Bolivia, I'm not going to get into too much. They had a revolution starting in 1952. The United States had supported various conservative candidates, but find themselves drawn more and more into the Bolivian conflict. That was left-leaning. They're a pretty poor country, so naturally they were interested in things like land reform. This was very appealing to Che Guevara, who was the Cuban revolutionary. He was Argentine, but had been active in the Cuban Revolution. And the United States was solidly opposed to any sort of leftist movement, and they would help the Bolivian army on the other side. And in fact, the CIA would work with the Bolivian army to have Che arrested and assassinated in Bolivia in 1967. Chile is the last example I'm going to talk about today. I think Vietnam deserves its own chapter that we'll talk about at some other time. Should be a little bit of an HOA review. Of course, Chile had been a solidly stable democratic country throughout the 30s. The United States had supported various conservative Chilean candidates, even as late as the 1960s. And this has been in a region that had seen all sorts of instability and military dictatorship, but not in Chile. But of course, the election of Salvador Allende really alarmed conservatives in Chile, and particularly the United States. When he was elected, the United States government and those conservatives worked hard to declare his victory unconstitutional. Of course, that was an unsuccessful attempt, but the U.S. ambassador pledged to do everything in their power to condemn Chile and Chileans to utmost deprivation and poverty because they were worried about the economic agenda of Salvador Allende and his pledge to nationalization and lowering income disparity, and how that would be at odds with U.S. Economic and political interests. Of course, immediately Nixon would authorize the overthrow of the democratically elected president. They did not matter that it was a small chance or how much money they had to throw at the problem, that they wanted in their world leaders anti-communist before anything else. Nothing else mattered. It didn't matter if they were democratic or whatnot. Here you see Secretary of State Henry Kissinger with General Pinochet, who will be their chosen one for a replacement for Pinochet. They had agreed to these low-level overflights. They wanted to create a terrorist-like scenario that would create psychological effect that would help destabilize the country enough to have the people accept military rule despite their decades of democracy. It proves to be effective. They launch an attack. The United States CIA helps launch an attack on the presidential palace in September 11th, 1973, killing Allende, implementing torture, human rights violations that the United States is complicit in. Pinochet was so comfortable with the United States that he even had a former Allende foreign minister assassinated in the United States in Washington, D.C. in a car bomb. He would establish a military dictatorship, as I said, violating human rights and becoming a close friend of the United States, despite murdering 3,000 people, torturing 30,000 people, and having so many hundreds of thousands flee in exile. Here he is with Kissinger, Reagan, George H.W. Bush again. Pinochet would step down from power in 1990. Chile would transition to democracy. He was indicted in 1998, but would die before actually being convicted of anything. And here are Chileans kind of remembering their own September 11th. Here's the question. What are the identifiable patterns in these cases? What motivates U.S. actions? And the large question is, how does the developing world, how is it impacted by Cold War tensions? Consider it.